Session 3, boundaries. So basically, the overarching shift that I want us to make, this big belief shift, I want us to realize, this idea that it's mean to cut people off or tell people no. I think that's where a lot of us naturally are. Like, cutting someone off, telling them no feels unnatural and it feels really, really mean. So we need to move from that to this idea that, you actually need boundaries for your baby's safety and for your baby's proper development. Now, we need boundaries for a lot of reasons, actually, a lot of them totally unrelated to our baby's safety and proper development. However, I recognize the fact that as mothers, a lot of times this is the driving force. We may not think to do something for ourselves, but by golly, I will do it for my baby. I will do it for my child. So let's remember as we kind of enter into this that these boundaries are not just for us. It's not just for our comfort or ease. It is for our baby's safety and proper development. So the way that I want us to start this discussion is to actually talk about what boundaries are. When I say boundaries, what is that? Boundaries are what separate us from not us. It's basically like, okay, this is me versus everything else. My responsibility, not my responsibility. Those are boundaries. Now, the important thing to acknowledge is that boundaries exist whether or not we acknowledge them, whether or not others acknowledge them. They're there, they exist. So if we're not aware of them, what happens? Well, we end up either getting our boundaries trampled on and allowing that to happen, being the doormat, or we end up trampling on other people's boundaries. So first thing is acknowledging, oh, boundaries do exist. And if I can have a clear understanding of what they are, then I can use this to my advantage as a human being. We're going to talk about how that actually works and throughout this. So the first thing I want us to do is talk about the types of boundaries. There are several different categories of main kind of overarching boundaries that we're going to discuss. The first one is physical. Now, physical boundaries, an example of a physical boundary is your skin. So this is a physical boundary. Everything that's me is inside of this skin. It's held in by this skin. Everything that's not me is outside. Same thing with a fence. A fence is a physical boundary. This is my property. That is not my property. I'm going to mow this grass. I'm not going to mow that grass. So that's a physical boundary. And then we have emotional boundaries. And emotional boundaries are our specific individual beliefs that make up us. They're what's important to us. They're our goals, our values, and there are special thoughts, everything that adds up to us. I'm actually going to go through these because I just remembered I've got this written out better in other places. So I'm just going to say what they are and then we'll go through them a little deeper. So we've also got spiritual boundaries, and then we have sexual boundaries, and finally we have relational boundaries. So going back through this really quick, like I said, skin is a physical boundary, a fence is a physical boundary. Here's something that's important for us to recognize though. A physical boundary or a boundary, the difference between a boundary and a defense is that a boundary allows the good in while keeping the bad out. So in this example of the skin, like our skin absorbs a lot of things. It absorbs magnesium. If you rub topical magnesium on your skin, it's going to absorb that. And that's really, really good. So it allows the good in, but it's going to protect as well. If we get a cut, then our boundary has been breached and maybe something could come in, some invader could come in through that breached boundary. Same with the fence. Our fence is keeping our neighbors. Maybe we have a neighbor we don't like, that we don't trust. We have a fence and that protects us from that neighbor. But the fence can have a gate. If we really like our neighbor, we can invite them in for lemonade. That's totally fine. But so we're allowing good in, we're keeping the bad out, as opposed to a defense, which is just going to block everything out. I am an island, I'm isolated. So that's the big difference. Next, let's talk about these emotional. So, like I said, emotional boundaries, that's our specific individual beliefs that make up us. That's what's important to us. It's our goals, it's our values, our special thoughts and opinions. It's everything that combines to individual you. It's you, Mackenzie. You, Leanne. Very individual to who you are. And then spiritual boundaries. So what I like to say is, even God, especially God, has boundaries. Let's think about the Genesis story. Adam and Eve are in the garden. God says, here's all this stuff. Here's what you can have. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. And if you do this thing, then these will be the consequences. It was all laid out. Like, that was a boundary. And then the boundary was violated. And then what happened? There was a consequence. So that is a very clear recognition that, okay, so even from creator down to creation, boundaries exist and boundaries are in place, and they're in place to actually protect us and help us thrive. So something else that's kind of interesting to think about is just the fact that, our spiritual development cannot be forced. And we have boundaries. So the Lord accepts our boundaries. If I'm not willing to do any spiritual work, if I'm not willing to have a spiritual relationship of any type, whatever, and however we view it, whatever that means to us, if we are putting boundaries up, well, those are going to be accepted. You can't force love. Like, God's not going to force you to love him. So that's recognizing that boundaries go both ways. He allows us to take part in decision making, and that's really the only way to receive true love and affection. We know this from our lives, right? You can't make somebody love you. Much as you may want to, it doesn't work that way. So to receive true love and affection, we allow for the other person to make their own decisions. And then we have boundaries. So we can glean so much from these spiritual boundaries for all of the other ones. And, the way that things have been established, how we can emulate that in the rest of these boundaries. Next one, sexual boundaries. This one is really, really tough. Especially for those of us who have experienced a violation to a sexual boundary. It's a really, really difficult boundary. The reason that sexual boundaries or sexual violations to boundaries are detrimental is because we are not only that's not only violating a sexual boundary, it's actually violating every other boundary as well. It's a physical violation. It's an emotional violation. It's a spiritual violation. It's a relational violation. So that's why when we have that specific boundary violation, we can feel it on every plane. And it takes particular working through to heal with that. And when we think about boundaries with sexuality, it depends on the relationship for what is safe and appropriate. And, depending on the relationship, what's safe and appropriate with your partner is going to be different from what's safe and appropriate with somebody else. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with these relational boundaries as well. So relational boundaries, the relationship is what dictates what is appropriate. So the context there is everything. You and your husband can speak, touch, and engage in ways that are totally appropriate. But if a stranger, your husband can put his hand on the small of your back and you feel great. You feel loved, connected, just emotionally together. If a stranger in Walmart comes up and puts his hand on the small of your back, there are going to be fisticuffs. Like, this is not okay. This is not appropriate. Why? Because the relationship dictates that is absolutely a violation. That is absolutely inappropriate. So we have to recognize that it is all about relationship, and the way that you speak to your spouse is also different from the way you speak to your parents or the way you speak to your children. The way that you speak to your children is there's a range of okay versus how someone else speaks to your child. It's different. We recognize this, like we innately understand that this is the case. But sometimes boundaries can get pretty nebulous, and that's why we're going to walk through this and hopefully make things nice and clear.